If you could just talk about your role in the ministry, like what and how you got to the ministry and what you were doing there.
Okay, so I think I was in the ministry for 12 years, 2 as a provincial coordinator. At the time, we had a different model in the ministry. I still say we, even though I'm not there anymore. So we had a different model where there were regions, and from the different regions, we had coordinators who were connected to community. Coordinators at that time were secondees with the intention that we would go for a year, 2 years or so, and bring community voice to the ministry. So I was seconded from North Island College, where I was an Aboriginal education counselor. So even the words were different in those days, right? Yeah. And probably what led me to be paying attention to what was going on in the Ministry of Education was at the time, before I went to the ministry, I was on school board for 2 terms and served on the BCSTA Provincial Committee for Aboriginal Education. So I had those relationships there, which draw, and I served on provincial committees. In those days, we had improvement agreements. Of course, I was really interested in that work. We had our own, in the school district I was in, local education agreements. So I came with a real interest to improve the outcomes for Aboriginal students.
When was that?
So let's see, 1996 maybe?
Okay. And then you were there for 12 years.
And then after, so I did serve 2 years as a provincial coordinator. And Lorna Williams was the director at that time. And when Lorna left the ministry, I applied for and became the director of Aboriginal Education and served in that position for 10 years. Prior to coming to UVic. So as director, I oversaw Aboriginal education for the province. That meant engaging with communities and school districts. One of our big agendas was enhancement agreements. So improvement agreements had been changed to enhancement agreements under Lorna. And so I was involved with implementing those. So I had a team that would go out and support districts and communities to build relationships. And, at the core of enhancement agreements was bringing in the voice of Aboriginal communities to determine what they wanted for their kids.
Are they still going on?
They're not going on anymore. So that ended maybe 2 years ago now. It's on the website anyways, if you wanted that accurately. So that was one of my main portfolios, but also overseeing targeted funds. Targeted funds are really important in BC. So targeted funds are dollars that go to school districts who, for Aboriginal kids, self-identified Aboriginal students. And so what we mean by self-identification is the parents, when they enroll their kids, identify their children as having Aboriginal ancestry. So there are other agreements and funding processes for kids that come from on-reserve. Targeted funds are meant to improve outcomes for Aboriginal kids. And the enhancement agreements. Make sure this is going. Looks like it's going. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So the enhancement agreements were an effort to bring community voice to processes and decision making for outcomes for Aboriginal kids within the school districts. Just tell you, if I get a call at 11 or
That's good. I'm terrible with technology.
Okay. So some of this might not seem fully relevant to the curriculum, but to me it's really relevant because there's been an evolution of Indigenous education in this province and trying to serve our kids better. The other thing that was going on during my time as director was the development of jurisdiction agreements with First Nations. So the negotiations, the First Nations were represented by the First Nations Education Steering Committee, FNESC, and I was on the provincial negotiation team. And we negotiated some agreements, one of those being jurisdiction of First Nations in BC. What's important about that, I mean, there's many things that are important about that, and for First Nations schools and for First Nations, it really gave them the jurisdiction over education of their kids on reserve. So that was really important to them. But in relation to the curriculum, you know, when you're working on things like negotiation agreements and outcomes, people always want to go to what's going on in the classroom. So the political leaders, you know, school boards, the ministry, we want to talk about curriculum as being the direction. This is what we're doing. But people always want to talk about how it's being done, because those interactions in classrooms are really important. How our kids are treated is really important. The access to content is really important. And so one of the things that was brought to the table was English 12. So it's a course that everybody needs to graduate. It's mandated that you have to have English 12 or some form of English 12 to graduate. It's also a gatekeeper for universities. And so as part of the jurisdiction agreement, we negotiated the development of English First Peoples 12, and then later 10 and 11. And so that came into place, that curriculum change came into place really legally through that process. And in some ways, you know, the way curriculum is written in BC, or at least was at that time, there really is no reason a teacher could not incorporate the texts and the pedagogies that are in English First Peoples 12 through a mainstream English course. But it wasn't happening.
Right.
And so that set the stage to develop that series of courses. And probably, you know, one of the key things that came out of that was in setting the stage to do that work. People were gathered to work with our team, and FNESC, we worked in partnership with FNESC to create the foundation or the principles for that course, what we would build that course on. And the people that invited to that table were leading scholars in the province, leading Indigenous scholars. So we had Lorna Williams, I believe, I'm not positive, but I think Joanne Archibald might have been there. Jeanette Armstrong was there, and others. So many identified Indigenous scholars who had been working for years around K-12 education. And that table worked really hard to come up with the First Peoples Principles of Learning. And those First Peoples Principles of Learning, as you know, are now part of the BC curriculum. So the BC curriculum points to those principles. And so although that, you know, that committee was all about developing an English 12 course, I see that as a pivotal point.
Foundational.
Yeah, because it gave direction, not just to English 12, but it was picked up by teachers, by FNESC, and then by the curriculum committees as a way to inform how we would change practice.
And those principles are maintained, same principles? Same
principles, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
so to me, that's a really key piece of work.
Yeah.
What else? So those were my main roles. When the curriculum change happened, or the beginning of the curriculum change, I was there for the beginning of that. The work carried on after I left. I still had all my other duties, and I was not, a curriculum developer. However, we had really interesting leadership at the time for about 2 years, I think, in the ministry. We had really changed things. Physically, we knocked down the walls, created open space with the idea of more collaboration between people who were doing curriculum, people who were doing legislation, people who were doing finance, that there would be more collaboration. And through, so I was on the leadership team with Rod Allen, led that team. And even our concept of meeting, we always met in an open space where people were invited to come in and join. And it was just a time of a changing process. And so I guess I see that openness in leadership as being really important because, why? Because I guess, for me as lead of Aboriginal education at the time, there was more possibility to bring my voice to the table. The hierarchies had changed, and so this leadership table got to sit together and actually talk about education matters, talk about things like curriculum change, like pedagogy, principles of learning.
So you were in on the conversations about the curriculum change generally, not just like one aspect of it.
That's right, yeah. So it wasn't that, okay, so what are we going to do for Aboriginal kids anymore? We were changing, I think, so again, you know how one thing changes the other. I would say one thing that enhancement agreements did was we really heard from Aboriginal communities in the development of those and implementation of those agreements that they didn't want their kids being pulled out and having services just for Aboriginal kids, and that the way to improve outcomes for Aboriginal kids was to improve outcomes for everybody. It was at that time that we started to hear right about that time of curriculum change and through enhancement agreements, that the phrase that Aboriginal education is for everybody. And we started to articulate that in, it became part of the discourse in many settings, talking not just about how we educate our kids, but how we needed to re-educate the system. That everybody needed a better education in what Indigenous BC is. Who are the Indigenous people in BC? What are our true histories that have been left out of the system? That misunderstandings and misinformation needed to be corrected. That people needed to work together to better understand what folks meant by Indigenous pedagogies, and to correct content errors that had occurred. So that idea, I think, was really the idea that Aboriginal education is for everybody, and we would probably use new language today, but that was the language of the day, and I think the ministry continues to use the word Aboriginal because it's in the Constitution. But that idea, that concept, meant that we recognized that public servants also needed a better education. And not just from, this wasn't, this opening up about what public servants needed to know wasn't just about Indigenous peoples either. So at that time we were also, mostly under Rod's leadership, doing things like having young people, students, come in to ministry meetings and inform us about their education experience. We had some Indigenous students come in and inform us about their education experience. We had a table of knowledge keepers that met on a couple of occasions to help inform those who would be doing the curriculum work, leading the curriculum teams. So not the teams themselves. And in fact, I didn't get involved with any of the teams. So we had curriculum teams, that bring in experts.
Yeah.
But I was with the leadership team.
Right.
So helping to set the stage for the work that others would do. And that leadership team, had the opportunity to sit with knowledge keepers on a few occasions. We brought those folks together to talk to us about their education experience, to talk to us about Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and what they thought was important to include in the education system, and how curriculum could help to do that.
So the First Peoples principles were in place already. And was there like any kind of explicit connection between those things in those leadership team meetings?
Yeah, I think people pointed to them often,
Right.
And then the leadership, the leads of curriculum teams knew about those, came to understand them, and bring them to their curriculum teams. As you know, the structure of the curriculum is really different, and it's guided by principles, and one of those principles are the First Peoples principles of learning. And so that, I'm doing this because we had a chart at the time, right? There was a chart, and everything was founded on these three sets of principles, and one of the principles was First Peoples principles of learning. And so that's how the curriculum teams operated. Every team operated with that basic understanding. I don't know personally how that always operated. For instance, I don't know how the math team, as an example, would have picked those things up. The other thing we did that I was able to share in was the resourcing of Indigenous educators to those teams. FINESC also helped us to do that. So as we were inviting people to come in and work with curriculum teams, we worked really hard to identify where are the Indigenous educators in the field that can help to do this work.
So your relationships from before must have been very helpful in that. You
Absolutely, yeah. And having the enhancement agreements meant that I, or members of my team, knew districts really well. And I guess there's another piece, if I think about the evolution, and this goes way back. I don't remember what years we were doing district reviews. So I don't know if you remember district reviews, but there was a process of district reviews where it must have been, I think Lorna would have been on some of the, Lorna was on some of the district review teams, so that work happened when Lorna was there.
Like in the 90s?
Yeah, must have been in the 90s. So it was the province's desire to engage more closely with districts on learning outcomes. Political things go in waves. And so teams would go into districts. It was slightly like, what did we used to do in schools? There used to be, accreditation of schools.
Right.
So it was slightly like that. These district review teams, I think the process lasted for 3 years maybe. But you could look it up if you're interested. But there's a reason I'm telling this story is those district review teams would be made up of, there would always be a superintendent on every team. There would be a ministry person or two on the team. There would be somebody from often a parent on the team. So a variety of folks, an educator, teacher on the team, and these teams of about 7 people would go into a district and visit the district, visit some of the schools, interview principals, interview groups of teachers, go through the data, so the outcome data for kids. In those days it was FSA data, graduation data, go through the data and start to look for issues, what was going on, what things could be noticed. For instance, lower graduation rates for Aboriginal kids. We know that's been an issue. We'd also look at things like, where do you lose a kid? So we would take a look at the data and see that at grade 10 there'd be a sharp drop of Aboriginal kids. That seemed to be a problem point. We had data folks helping us look at things like for kids who you know, when can you see a problem start to occur? Does it start showing up in the data at grade 4, at grade 7? When are those things happening? And then having conversations with the district teams about, what do you think is going on and how could we make this different? But we would also notice things like the presence or non-presence of Indigenous identity. Could kids see themselves reflected in the way the buildings looked, in what was going on in the buildings? The teams would talk to students. So it was really, really intense work. Not everybody loved it, but what it meant was folks that were working, again, the public servants in the ministry, plus the superintendents who were involved in district reviews. You know, we all went back to our organizations with a better idea of who the districts were, what kinds of issues were going on in particular districts, what kinds of things needed to systemically change over the whole province. And so it was in those places, you know, having that knowledge and that relationship, I think, was really helpful. I want to be careful that I'm not saying that I think district reviews were a great idea. There were things I think that were really valuable about them, but I don't want to judge whether district reviews were a good thing or not. But my point is, the ministry had a way to begin to know districts in a way that we hadn't for a long time. That we were getting to hear the voice of a variety of people. We were getting an understanding about changes that could improve outcomes for kids. District reviews were not Aboriginal specific. It was about the education for everybody. It was, you know, that kind of view.
So those things were happening before the curriculum changed.
That's
so
right.
Sort of, in some ways, even though unknown, laying groundwork for what could happen.
Yeah, that's what I think is that those things that came before were really moving us in that direction of knowing we needed to make change.
So then when the BC Ed plan kind of was revealed after a few years, did you see that the First Peoples principles were reflected in that appropriately? How did you see that?
I think they were good attempts. I think a lot of people didn't trust the integrity because, of course, you're mixing political and practice, right? But things like that, like jurisdiction, like the voice that we had from enhancement agreements, and then also there's the TIFA agreement, which is the I can't remember what it stands for. It's an Educational Foundations Agreement. No, I've got it wrong. Anyways, it's another agreement with First Nations. the reason I mention these things is all of them gave us the mandate to do things differently. And so people like myself and others could say, well, we have to do this work because we have these agreements in place that tell us we have to do this work, which can be powerful in making change in government. Is when people know that they're required to do something. So if your curriculum leads know that they have an obligation to act in certain ways. Of course, I realize now I'm speaking about the curriculum changes as though it's all about Aboriginal education. Of course, curriculum changes, that's only one part of it. You know, I think driving curriculum change was, you know, I think we were trying to be responsive to today's world, that kids, as a result of, and I'm not saying technology drove it, but it's one factor that kids now carry any information they want in their pockets. And so, you know, our world has changed significantly, and education needed to catch up. Needed to be a process of enabling young people to be good critical thinkers, to be creative, to exercise their own volition over their own education. You know, like the world was changing, and curriculum needed to change to respond to that. Part of that happened to be Aboriginal education, and is good for Indigenous kids, and yeah, but it wasn't just about that. Yeah.
No, but you came back to earlier. You said like something about, you know, Aboriginal education is good for everybody, which was kind of like an underpinning of the whole thing, right? If the First Peoples principles are foundational to the change, then that's got to be sort of a key piece to everybody's thinking about how the curriculum evolved.
Yeah.
So you've seen where the curriculum sits now, like as K to 9 or now K to 10. How are you happy with how it's moved? So where does it go next?
You know, honestly, I'm so uninvolved with K to 12 education right now because I'm so focused on supporting adults to be speakers of their own language. That's where my scholarship is gone. But, you know, there are things that I notice as a parent. I have a kid in school. I notice with the adults that I work with, many of them are working in schools. So things like acknowledgement of territory. People seem to be more aware of the territories that they're living in, who their Indigenous neighbors are, you know, things that were just not on people's agenda. I don't know if I'm naive, but it seems to me there's been a change in the school system around that. I really can't speak about how things are rolling out.
But when you left, you saw that there was positive change moving forward in a general sense.
Yeah, and things all seem to work together as well. So when I came to UVic, as you know, has IED 373, a mandated course for our education students. That's now required in every education program in the province, but UVic had that in advance of it being required. I think that's all part of the same conversation, in curriculum change, and then teachers say, we need support to be able to do this. There can be mandates for it, but there can also be the teachers saying, hey, I want to, or the pre-service teachers, I want to learn these things. I want to be able to do this in my own classroom.
Did you have anything to do with the shifting assessment when you were in the ministry? Like,
yeah, so only from the leadership table. So, and again, that was one of the processes I really appreciated that Rod led. Was there was room for all of us to talk about those kinds of things. So although I wasn't, part of assessment teams, we had those big conversations so that people would be supported to do their work and be able to test their ideas.
So there was alignment between the assessment and the curriculum.
Yes, yeah.
That started to happen.
Definitely, yeah. Alignment between a lot of things. So, even with the folks doing finances being at that leadership table, because the way you finance the work or, the designs, the square footage needed for schools, I don't know that we're there yet, but all those things relate, and yet they can sit so separate in a ministry. And having a leadership table that brought people together, not just to talk about their own agendas, but where everybody talks about everything. And I think it changes people's thinking. And I talk about the square footage for schools because one of the things we know is our language and culture programs often aren't allotted space. And so we have language teachers who are hired but don't get the space or the resources to do their work.
So it was actually a place where everybody could learn as well as contribute.
Yes.
Right? Learn from different aspects of education.
Yeah. The other thing that Rod did for us, and it wasn't just Rod, but he had the support of the deputy minister of the day, was bring in education for the ministry. So, lead educators, scholars, world-renowned educators to come and talk to us about education in the 21st century and to start us thinking about those kinds of things. So that was really different than what I had seen before, where policy analysts knew their work and only their little bit of work.
Right. So as I'm thinking about how to frame up the whole story, it's not my story. I'm just trying to capture it for people. So on one hand, I really would like to acknowledge the people who are telling the story. So trying to figure that out and connecting with them about what that looks like. But do you see that the Aboriginal and the Indigenous ed piece is part of the story, or is it a separate piece?
No, to me it's very much a part of the story.
As you were talking about it seemed to be.
So within the Ministry of Education, there's always people that are considered, special interest, and they have their ideas, the thing that they want to be included in education. And then we stuff all these things into curriculum because there's a need. And there were, and there continue to be, people who think that we needed Indigenous specific courses. So English First Peoples 12 clearly is an Indigenous specific course. And there were some thinkers who thought that was the way we would incorporate Indigenous knowledge and pedagogies into a child's K-12 experience by having these mandated courses along the way. But working with the knowledge keepers, with what we had heard from community, I think there was a belief that it shouldn't be a series of separate courses and experiences, but that Indigenous pedagogy and content needed to be integral to everything. So in all the curriculum, that was a real choice point. Perhaps not everybody agrees with it, and I know folks worry that it could get watered down, or that teachers won't handle it well. But I think there were enough voices telling us that it needed to be integral to the work. And I really felt like from my role as a director in Aboriginal education that my voice was respected, and that the need to include not just me but the voice of others was respected. Because I would never position myself as the expert, although I think that was my job description actually was something like the provincial expert in Aboriginal education. But to me, what an expert is somebody who facilitates the voices of the community. And I think that happened in the curriculum process. I think there's a danger if we don't allow it to continue to happen, like that voice still needs to be really present. I don't know what the plan is for feedback loops in the ministry about the curriculum. I know we were really trying to use technology in the day to let anybody have a say in what was going on, but to simply use technology excludes folks that that are not going to go that path to have their voice heard. So I don't know what's going on in the ministry now, but I do think there needs to be feedback loops to make sure things are working well, to re-guide and move things as they need to happen.
So I think one of the unique features about this whole story is that there was wide consultation over a period of time, and if that stops, and it becomes a different kind of document, a different kind of process.
Yeah, I think that consultation was super important, but you're right, it can't just stop. Because I don't know
that's helpful.
I'm not naive enough to believe we got it right the first time. I think it should be iterative, it should be changing, it should be responding. And if we did the first part right, it means that students, parents, community members will be part of keeping things changing.
And I know I've heard Rod say that before, that's the intention, but as people change, intentions sometimes change too. So, and that's one of my interests in writing down the story, so that we don't forget the processes that went on that are important for every change to happen. Cool.
Yeah, those processes are super important, and it can't just be technology-based feedback. That can be one form.
No, face-to-face is That's it for me.
Okay.
I'm just going to turn this up. I need you to sign this though.
Okay.